Hello, my name is Mike Moyle. On April 25th, 2023, I gave a talk at the Marin History Museum regarding Marin's dairy history. Unfortunately, that talk could not be recorded, and so I'm recording this separate video to share it with anybody who may be interested. The subject of my talk is Marin's dairy history. It was a talk that I was originally supposed to give for the museum back in 2020, but unfortunately, COVID intervened. My primary role as a local historian here in Marin County is in connection with the IDESST, the Sausalito Portuguese Cultural Center in Sausalito. Much of the work that I do is for that center regarding the history of the Portuguese community in Marin County. The Portuguese were one of the primary participants in the dairy industry in Marin, and they had a particularly strong focus and concentration in southern Marin. This map shows the dairies that were operated by members of the Portuguese community in southern Marin. When we say dairies, we are referring simply to places where cows are raised, milk is produced, milk or cheese, other dairy products, and then sold either at wholesale or retail. Now, when we also say dairies, not necessarily all of the land, as we'll learn, was owned by the dairy farmers. In some cases, they owned the land. In other cases, they leased the land. But the remarkable thing here in southern Marin is that every one of the dairies that was here was part of this Portuguese group. A few years ago, I met Dewey Livingston, who many of you may know is a prominent historian here in Marin County. Dewey has done a tremendous amount of local history work, but has also had a significant focus on dairy history and has written extensively about it. These are a couple of the books you can see at the bottom of the page that Dewey has written. The first two really focus on dairy farming. The second two are more about the areas, but also have a good deal of information about the dairies that were in those areas. Dewey and I spoke about our respective work and realized that we each covered slightly different areas of the county. So neither of us really knew exactly how many dairies had operated in the county over the years. We decided to collaborate on a project we called the Marin Dairy Project in an effort to identify all of the dairy locations that had existed at any time in Marin history over the years, and also to try and find out as much as we could about the individuals and families that operated those dairies. As you can see from this map, which shows probably about 340 of the roughly 400 dairy locations that we've identified so far, dairies were located all over Marin and in relatively close proximity to each other. So I like to say there probably is no place you can go in Marin except for possibly the mountains and ridge tops where you would be more than a mile away from a dairy location. As I said earlier, when we speak of dairies, we do have to distinguish between the ownership of the real estate, the land and buildings, and then the ownership of what we might call the movables, the cattle and equipment. In some cases, dairy farmers would have their own cattle, but would be leasing property for short terms. In many cases, too, dairy operations were in the form of a fluid partnership of perhaps 2, 3, or 4 individuals who would come and go, and the mix would change over time, which certainly complicates it because often there were very few records kept of exactly what those partnerships were, as contrasted to it being a little bit easier to trace the ownership of real estate. This picture, by the way, is the Cummings Dairy in Lucas Valley, a picture taken in around 1923. And we'll come back to the very interesting history of this picture. So we're talking about dairies today, but when did the first cows arrive in California? Well, they came in 1768. About 200 head arrived with the so-called Sacred Expedition that came up from Baja California to help settle Alta California. By 1800, that number had expanded dramatically to about 74,000 head. And those cattle were scattered all over California, but certainly throughout Marin County, which at that time was divided up into the 21 original ranchos that had been granted by the Mexican government. San Rafael is indicated by the star here by way of reference. And so at that time, cattle were primarily used for food, of course, when that was necessary, but there was a very small market for beef. And so they were primarily used to produce hides, leather, and tallow. The fat would be rendered down because those two items, the hides and the tallow, could be exported. And so they provided an opportunity for trade. Of course, when the gold rush arrived, then those cattle became extremely valuable, and many of them were sold at that time for use as food. However, the transition then occurred not long after the gold rush from beef to dairies. And it happened primarily at the outset up at Point Reyes, which at that time was called the Butter Rancho because of its very favorable conditions, primarily grass and water, for raising cows and producing dairy products. Clara Steele is thought to have been California's first cheesemaker, getting her start up there in Point Reyes in 1857. And as long as you had cows and feed and water and market access, you could make a profit. However, at that time, transportation, the market was, of course, in San Francisco. And to get the products from Point Reyes down to San Francisco, the only really viable means was by schooner from Bolinas or for Drake's Bay. And so the primary product that was produced, as indicated by the Butter Rancho name, was butter and some cheese, of course, because those products could be produced and then stored and transported without spoiling. However, 1868, ferry service began between Sausalito and San Francisco, and a couple of years later, 1874, rail service began from Sausalito heading north. This is a map showing the North Pacific Coast Railroad line that opened up in 1874, and you can see it goes from Sausalito all the way up into Sonoma County along that yellow route up through Tamales and on north. And you can also see that the map indicates dairyland all along the route because this new mode of transportation obviously provided the opportunity for farmers along the route to provide fresh dairy products, milk and cream, that could be transported by rail down to Sausalito and then in by ferry to San Francisco. So the history of the dairy industry and those who worked on it here in Marin is a very interesting one. There were, in the early days in particular, in the 1850s and on, many of the dairy farmers who were working up in the Point Reyes area were Scandinavian, some Irish, variety. But over time, individuals from two specific, rather remote locations, each in their own way, became very important in Marin dairy history. The first was immigrants who came from the Azores, or Azores, as they're known in Portuguese. And the second was a group of primarily Swiss, but also some Italians from the Ticino canton in Switzerland and the adjoining area across the border in Italy. So we'll just take a quick look at the Azores. First of all, although there are 9 islands in the Azores, Azores or Azores, by the way, means hawk in Portuguese, or hawks. The Azorean flag shows a yellow hawk with 9 stars for the 9 islands. Although there were 9 islands, though, the primary immigrants, as far as we can determine, that came here specifically to Marin County, came from the 3 islands that are circled, Faial, Pico, and São Jorge. And among those 3, the majority were from São Jorge. We haven't quite been able to determine why that is. There were certainly people from other places too, other islands, but the folks from São Jorge seem to dominate here in Marin. The fact that Azoreans came here to California at all was in some ways a historic accident. And we like to say, when I do give this talk for 3rd graders, I say there are 2 W's that were involved: wind and whales. And that's because Azoreans, or the Azores, were on the route of the very early efforts by the New England whalers to expand the scope of their hunting grounds. So initially they went out into the Atlantic. They found whales around the Azores, and then those were depleted over time, and they gradually made their way south in the Atlantic, ultimately coming around the tip of South America and finally ending up in San Francisco, probably around the 1815, 1820 period. In addition, though, to stopping at the Azores, the New England whalers found that Azoreans were eager to join their crews. So folks from the Azores became regular crew members on New England whaling ships, ultimately going back with them to New England on the return voyage. And that's why you have such a large concentration of Portuguese and primarily Azoreans in the Massachusetts, Rhode Island area, as well as here in San Francisco, in California. But even Herman Melville noted in Moby Dick that Azoreans seemed to make the best whalemen. When they arrived here in San Francisco, many whaling ships would stop in Sausalito, in what is called Whalers Cove, was called Whalers Cove, now the area off of Old Town at the south end of Sausalito, to reprovision for water and wood to repair their ships. And so it's likely that the first Portuguese, the first Azoreans here in the Bay Area would have come ashore right here in Sausalito, and certainly would have had a chance to see Marin and become a little bit familiar with it. In fact, Marin has some resemblance to the Azores. These are shots of cows in the Azores. And also, Azoreans, as you can see, are familiar with raising dairy cattle. That goes back for many, many years. So it's not surprising that when the market for dairy products grew here and there was an opportunity to produce them in Marin, that Azoreans helped to fill the need for dairy farmers. This shows a little bit of the prevalence of Portuguese in and around Marin. These are Portuguese halls. The IDESST you saw earlier is just one of them here in Sausalito. There's another hall in Novato, one in Petaluma. Sebastopol, Vallejo, and Benicia are the closest to Sausalito, closest to Marin. There were 2 others, one in Tamales and one in Point Reyes, but those are no longer in existence. Turning to the Swiss and the Swiss Italians, this is the canton of Ticino, which you can see it borders with Piemonte and Lombardia in Italy. Very mountainous part of Switzerland. You can see here the map showing the 3 rivers in that area from which many of the families came. Again, not surprisingly, people who were very familiar with cattle raising and dairy production. This is a interesting book, A Farm in Marin by Sherry Richland, in which she had noted or charted the where many of the families in Marin, the names in all caps, what parts of the canton in Ticino they came from. Needless to say, in West Marin in particular, you find a prevalence of these names going back many years. So, what is the current situation? Well, dairy ranches in Marin have declined, needless to say, over time. This rough chart is somewhat of an estimate, but it shows roughly the decline, probably from a high point around the start of the 1900s, and then gradually going down until today. There are only 20 cow's milk dairies remaining in Marin. This is actually a chart or a map was prepared a few years ago by the Malt organization, showing at that time where the various dairies were. Now, these were dairies that were both cow's milk and other than cow's milk, goat and water buffalo. Those are the ones shown with the blue asterisks. But since that time, a number of them have gone out of business. There have been at least one that has reopened, but we are at a net of 20 cow's milk dairies that are remaining in Marin today. So, what happened over the years? Well, there are many reasons for the decline here. Stricter sanitation and environmental regulations are something that are still a very significant factor today facing the dairy operators here in Marin. Increasing capital investment requirements. Earlier, it might have been possible to operate a dairy with relatively little capital investment other than a few cows and some equipment. Economies of scale over time. The huge dairies, for example, out in the Central Valley that we have today began to be much more economical to operate than smaller dairies. Changes in distribution networks, again, transportation has changed back from the earliest days when it was delivered by schooner, and now we have road transportation with refrigerated containers that make it much easier to transport milk long distances. There are real estate prices and property taxes over time. Today, competition from other so-called milks, plant-based milk products, and then simply recognizing the fact that dairy operation is a very, very hard business. It's 24/7, and it's difficult to find people who want to go into that business. I'd recommend a book called Farming on the Edge for anybody who is interested, particularly in the history of Marin from about the 50s to around 1990. Showing some of the factors that have led to the decline in dairies over time. One, needless to say, positive development is the Marin Agricultural Land Trust that has enabled the protection of open space in Marin. About 55,700 acres has been protected from development since 1980. Now, of course, you still, if you're going to run a dairy, you still have to have the economic wherewithal to be able to turn a profit on that land. Turning to the Marin History Museum's Unbottled exhibit, which I hope that all of you have had a chance to see. It's currently on display at the Boyd Gatehouse in San Rafael and will be there through August of this year. My favorite part, of course, are the dairy bottles, but that's not all there is. There are breweries, soda works, and pharmacy bottles as well. But focusing just on the dairy part of the exhibit, you'll see some early dairy milking technology. This is a carved wooden seat of the sort that the very earliest dairy operators used to use. The milkers, rather than taking the cows into the barn, would actually go out into the barnyard and milk them there into a pail. And they would strap on this seat. You can see them wearing it here, so they could move quickly and easily from cow to cow. We're not quite sure where the picture at the top is, but we do know that the photo at the bottom right, shows the Cunha Dairy, which is where the Miwok stables are today, out in Tennessee Valley, around 1892, one of the earliest confirmed pictures that we have of dairy operations here in Marin. Needless to say, the focus of the exhibit at the Boyd Gatehouse, the unbottled exhibit, is bottles. And here are some of the bottles that you will see when you get there, representing some of the several dairies that operated in Marin County. Of course, not all dairies had milk bottles that they used for distribution. This is a list showing the total collection of the Marin History Museum, and the names that are highlighted in red here are the bottles that are actually on exhibit. So you can see that only a small fraction of the museum's total collection can be displayed at the time of this exhibit, but they have a very representative collection at the Marin History Museum. As I said, there were many more dairies than are shown here. Those other dairies simply would either not have used bottles in the earliest days. Milk would have been delivered in a can and simply ladled into a container the consumer would provide. And then in later times, many dairies did not sell directly to consumers, but instead sold to wholesalers, to processors, who would in turn sell to the consumers. If some of you are on some of the social media that relates to Marin history, Lost Marin Facebook group is a good example. Nothing brings out nostalgia like milk delivery. And I think probably everybody who grew up with a milkman has some warm feelings about the milk delivery and the whole system of the delivery that primarily would have been during the post-World War II period. Here in Marin, over time, there were three primary large direct retail distribution, home delivery milk systems that were all here in San Rafael. One was Lucas Valley. Lucas Valley also had an actual dairy out in Lucas Valley, but they had this separate significant milk distribution company over on Ida Street in San Rafael. There was Marin County Milk, which was located right next to the train station. You can see the building down here next to the train tracks. And then the third was Roberts, which was out at what is very close to the Whole Foods out near San Rafael High School today. Lucas Valley ended up transitioning into Clover, Marin County Milk into Borden's, and Roberts into Golden State. This chart shows how those transitions occurred over the years, but that was certainly over the years consolidation of milk companies, dairies, and milk delivery in particular was a significant factor. You'll also see these posters when you go to the Boyd Gatehouse. Another significant company in Marin was one called the Marin Dairymen's Milk Company, which was also known as Marin Dell, which had been established as a cooperative in 1929 by a group of Marin dairymen. ultimately was acquired by Foremost in 1953. But their strategy was a little different in terms of distribution. They processed milk and then sold it under the Marin Dairy label to independent stores. And you can see sold only at independent stores on these posters that they had. Their primary processing facility was in San Francisco, down at 1675 Howard. If you go down there today, it's a BMW dealership in a building that hasn't changed very much, at least on the exterior. You'd recognize it from this picture. But that's where their processing facility was. So they would have their refrigerated trucks collect milk throughout Marin and Sonoma and then transport it into San Francisco for processing and then distribution to the stores that they supplied. I mention Marin Dairy also in particular because there is a really incredibly valuable resource that we have Marin Dairy to thank for. And these are a set of binders that were prepared by the company, by Marin Dairy, around 1950 or so to provide background information about every one of the suppliers to Marin Dairy, the individual dairies in Marin and Sonoma that were supplying the company. The binders have a tremendous amount of information in them. This shows the Marin Dairy directors at the time in 1950-ish when they were prepared. You'll see one Irishman, Erskine McNear, I think he's Irish, and then a couple of Swiss Italians, Barboni and Corda, and then a collection of Azoreans, Portuguese, Amaral, Nunes, Brazil, Pimentel, Silveira, and Moraes. All of whom were prominent dairymen in Marin County. The binders also have some great photos in them, and you can see here that it was a little bit of an amateurish effort to put them together, but an incredible effort. And you can see there's the hand lettering that was done on these photos, showing cows and people drinking milk and dairies and dairy equipment. It was really a labor of love. This is the table of contents for the first volume of the two binder set, which primarily focuses on the dairies, the Marin Dairy supplier dairies in Marin County. And you can see on the right the locations of those dairies around the county. And then, of course, there were roughly equal number up in Sonoma as well. This is an example, a partial example of what an entry for one of the suppliers looks like. This is for the Joseph Fagundes dairy that we'll see again in just a moment. But for every one of the dairies, somebody went out and took a series of photos showing some of the dairy buildings, some of their cows, and then also obviously sat down with the family and generated a history of a little bit about the dairy itself, but even more about the history of the family. And so for those of us who are interested in learning more about dairy families, it's just an incredible resource. This, as I mentioned, for Joseph Fagundes was actually the son of Manuel Fagundes. Most of the information in that particular entry focuses on Manuel Fagundes' life and work in Marin County. And I included this just because it shows a journey that was not atypical for any of the dairy farmers that came to Marin. Often they would start as an employee. They'd come and simply be a milker on a dairy. If they were successful at that, they might be able to amass a little capital, some savings, and then make an investment perhaps initially in some cows. And so maybe they could then become a partner in a partnership on one of the dairies. Again, they're successful at that and they aspire to own property. They could perhaps at some point down the line purchase an actual ranch and then operate it or lease it out themselves. So these dairies that are shown here were the dairies that the report, the Marin Dairy report, shows that Manuel Fagundes either worked on, leased, or owned over the years that he was active here in Marin from 1888 to 1954 or so. And he ended up owning the Fagundes Dairy, which is right along or was along 101, so where the YMCA building is today, just south of the Lucas Valley Road entrance or exit from 101 going north. So another interesting thing in the exhibit, if you go, you'll see this photo at the top in the unbottled display. And it's a little hard to see, but at the lower right, you can see it says Lucas Valley Dairy. When I went to the exhibit and saw it, I said, gee, I wonder where that is. I'd never seen this photo before. And so I consulted with Dewey Livingston, who is much better than I am at sort of recognizing landscape. And he said he certainly was in Lucas Valley, but he didn't think it was the so-called Lucas Valley Dairy, which is the one that was owned by the Grady family at the very west end of Lucas Valley. But instead, he thought it might be what we called the Nunes Dairy, which is where the juvenile hall is today. And in fact, I went over there not long after speaking with Dewey, and I revved up my drone because that's really the only way you can get a view these days that's comparable to the vistas that we had in the past. And I took the drone picture at the bottom, which you can see shows Lucas Valley Road over at the left, the Idleberry Road on the right, and the Lucas Valley Elementary. And that's pretty much where the picture must have been taken from, the perspective it was taken from, primarily because of, you can see the hillsides on the left there in the background. So I did I posted that picture to Lost Marin. I love to share pictures there, and I got a reply back from a woman named Karen Leclerc, and she said, you know, that picture shows my grandparents' dairy, the Cummings Dairy in Lucas Valley. And I have that picture, but the picture that you showed was only a small part of it. And so I had a chance to meet Karen, and she brought along the photo you see in the center there, which is this panoramic view of the dairy. And as you can see, the photo that the Marin History Museum had at the top was only one segment of this panorama, which was just fabulous to see. It's a very, very sharp photo, and Karen has now kindly donated it to the museum. I'd also, in the past, worked with George Nunes, whose father, Tom Nunes, had the dairy. And we had the picture you can see at the bottom, which was the Tom Nunes Dairy that was taken in the early 1960s. And you can see that some of the same buildings remain. This barn here, and then this one here, probably some of the same structures in the background here. So over the intervening period, not that many changes were made, but it was just great to be able to meet Karen and have this additional information. In addition to being able to tell us where it was and the additional part of the photo, she was also able to identify the members of her family in it, including her mom, June Cummings, who's on the top of the car here, her grandparents, and some other aunts and uncles there. And you can see here where the Cummings Nunes Dairy was located in Lucas Valley Road. A couple of the other dairies, Grady, Louis, and the Butcher Dairy around it there. So I thought I would end today just by sharing some of my favorite Marin dairy art. And in some cases, being able to show some counterparts of the photos. So in each case, we'll start with confirming where we're going. Then we'll see the photo, we'll see the painting, and then I'll show you a little shot of roughly a counterpart photograph of the painting as it looks today. So our first stop is going to be out here in Tennessee Valley, about halfway down the trail from the Miwok Stables, the trailhead up here, which was the Cunha Dairy we saw earlier in the presentation, coming down here to Tennessee Beach here. So at the Star, we have this painting, which was done by Rosemary Martin, showing the Martin and Betancourt Dairy. And then here's what it looks like today. Moving on, we're now going to go over to the Alto area of Mill Valley, just behind the Whole Foods on East Blythedale. Here's a shot showing the Alto Dairy that was located there, operated for many years by Roch Moraes, painting by George Demont Otis. And this is a photo taken again with my drone a couple of days ago, showing the same location. The dairy buildings would have been right in that white circle just below Camino Alto, going up over the hill. You can see the dairy structures in the old photo at the upper right, and you can also see that the dairy was right next to the railroad line heading to the Alto Tunnel. Next to Tiburon, just to the north of the Belvedere Lagoon there, where the school is today. The Hilarita Dairy was there, and this was a painting of the dairy by Jack Wisby. The Hilarita Dairy was owned by Hilarita Reed, and she leased it for many years to Portuguese dairymen, including the Avila family. Here's the same view today from the far side of the lagoon. You can see the school there, the Reed School in the white square. And you can see a photo of the dairy at the upper right from approximately the same perspective. Now up to San Rafael on Point San Pedro Road, just to the next to the quarry up there, the McNear Brick Yard and Quarry. This was a painting that was called Bayside Acres. It was entitled Bayside Acres by George Demont Otis. In fact, Bayside Acres was a little further south, and the dairy seen here is actually what was called the hospital dairy. The McNears had a rather large dairy operation there. You may recall that we saw Erskine McNear's name as a member of the Marin Dairy board earlier. They had a operating dairy that was up closer to where the golf course is today. And this was their so-called smaller hospital dairy, which primarily cared for cattle that were sick or needed some more focused attention. So actually, happily, this structure still exists today right there, just near the entrance to the quarry. You can see it from the road as you drive up there toward McNear's Beach. Heading out to Highway 1, we're now between Muir Beach and Stinson Beach at Slide Ranch. One of my favorite paintings of all. This is a painting of Slide Ranch, again by George Demont Otis. I took the picture at the bottom not too long ago. I can't fly my drone in the national, the GGNRA area, so I had to take this photo from the ground, which is not doesn't provide quite the same perspective. But you can see that George seemed to have taken some liberties with the coastline in his painting. Still a lovely, lovely painting. We don't have an older photo of the full Slide Ranch area, but the photo at the upper right shows at least the barn ready to receive a hay delivery. Heading up to Novato, we're now out north of Miwok Park, out along San Marin Drive. We're just near the high school there. This is where the Freitas Sea Ranch, one of the ranches that was owned by Manuel Freitas and his family. Painting was done by Jack Wisby, again, of the Freitas Ranch there. And here's what it looks like today. Again, a drone photo at the bottom and a historic photo showing that long driveway heading up to the Freitas Ranch at the upper right. So now that you've had some background with the paintings and artists and locations, you actually should be able to identify both this painting and the location. Give you just a moment. If you guessed it was in Lucas Valley and the painter was George Tomadotis, give yourself a gold star. In fact, it looks like it was probably very close to where the photograph we saw earlier of the Cummings dairy was taken. You can see the similarity on the hillside in the background. However, it looks like Miller Creek, which would be the body of water you can see there, is on the right side of the artist, which would mean that he was standing on the south side of Miller Creek, which would put him probably about here. Again, you can see Lucas Valley Road, Miller Creek to the right here, and Lucas Valley Elementary over in the upper right. But it's just a lovely, lovely painting. So let me just end with a couple of announcements regarding upcoming events for the Portuguese community. Those of you who live here in Marin will certainly be familiar with the Portuguese Holy Spirit festivals, the Festa do Espírito Santo, that occur every year. They occur at different times depending on when Easter falls. The first one this year is always the IDESI, the Portuguese Hall of Novato, will be holding their festa on May 21st, Sunday, May 21st. And then the following Sunday, which is Pentecost Sunday, the Sausalito Portuguese Cultural Center will hold their festa. They're very similar. If you've never been to one, though, I really encourage you to go see all of the activity and, of course, to participate in the lunch, the so-called sopas lunch, the delicious beef stew that has been prepared, at least in Sausalito's, in both cases, for over 100 years at both organizations. And then finally, just to note, with regard to dairies and Portuguese here in Marin, some of you may have seen that last September, the president of Portugal, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, was here in Marin and visited Tiburon for the groundbreaking of a project to create a mural dedicated to the memory of the Portuguese dairy farmers in Marin County. It's a mural that is located along Tiburon Avenue or Boulevard. You can see the site there at the lower right, just across the street from Del Mar School, which was the site of the so-called Little Reed Dairy. And the mural includes two components. One is a tile, or the so-called azulejos tile that has a representation of the photo you see at the top, the Little Reed Dairy, and then includes also the Portuguese stone mosaic at the bottom, the so-called calçadas. And so it's a wonderful reflection of two different Portuguese art forms. And the tiles, the azulejos, were in fact produced in Portugal based on a painting of the photo that was done by a local artist, João de Brito, and then a a gentleman from Sausalito's sister city of Cascais came here, a specialist in the installation of the mosaics, the calçadas. He came here a few months ago to install the calçadas. This we expect to be dedicated sometime around mid-July. The date has not yet been finalized, but we're very much looking forward to that. And just as a personal matter, I always want to thank and all of the different historical societies and groups here in Marin. Marin History Museum is certainly one of the primary ones, but there are several here, and all of them are very deserving of our support, and all of them are very happy to try to help people who are trying to do research about local history. So, thank you very much. I would say that if anybody is interested, has any questions for me, please feel free to contact me at this email address, history@idesst.org. I'll be happy to respond. I also have some supplemental materials related to the subjects talked about today, and if you would like, I'd be happy to send those to you. So, thank you very much.